The memory always starts with the smell of rain hitting hot asphalt and the sharp green scent of crushed stems. It's a sensory combination that shouldn't work, the industrial grit of my delivery van mixing with the delicate, curated atmosphere of her world. But it does. I didn't know it then, but that contrast would become the defining rhythm of my life. I was just a driver on a new route, focused on schedules and signatures. She was the fortress behind the counter, fortified by her routines and her shears. But the moment Isabella froze, caught off guard by the faint trace of sandalwood and cedar clinging to her own collar, everything shifted. That was the second I knew the professional distance between us hadn't just cracked, it had shattered. The air in the shop changed, heavy with a realization neither of us was ready to name. Dispatch called it the coastal run. I called it a headache. It was a winding 2-hour stretch of highway that hugged the cliffs, beautiful to tourists, but a logistical nightmare for anyone trying to keep a delivery schedule. The roads were narrow, the fog was unpredictable, and the stops were spaced just far enough apart to make efficiency impossible. But I needed the hours, and the coastal route came with a premium rate, so I took the keys and the manifest without complaint. The first stop on the list was Verdant and Vine. The name sounded pretentious, the kind of place that sold succulents for the price of a used car. I pulled the van up to the curb, tires crunching on gravel, and grabbed the first stack of inventory, heavy crates of floral foam and imported vases. I kicked the door shut with my hip and headed for the entrance. Stepping inside was like walking into a different climate. The humidity hit me first, a heavy, warm embrace that smelled of wet earth, moss, and the sweet, cloying decay of lilies. The air was thick, almost liquid, vibrating with the low, constant hum of the industrial floral cooler in the back. It was quiet, the kind of silence that feels deliberate, like a library or a church, and I was the disruption. I brought the noise of the road with me, the squeak of my boots, the thud of the cardboard box hitting the counter, the jangle of keys on my belt. "Delivery," I announced, though the word felt too loud in the stillness. That was when I saw her. She was standing behind a high drafting table in the back corner, her back to me. She didn't turn immediately. She was working on a massive arrangement, her hands moving with a terrifying sort of grace. She stripped thorns from long-stemmed roses with a small, curved knife, the motion fluid and practiced. Snap, strip, place. Snap, strip, place. It was surgical. She wasn't just arranging flowers, she was engineering them. "You're late," she said without looking up. Her voice was cool, low, and completely devoid of the customer service sweetness I was used to encountering. "Traffic on the 1, I said, sliding the digital clipboard across the polished concrete counter. "It's a parking lot out there." She finally turned. Isabella. I didn't know her name then, but I remember the impact of her gaze. She looked at me not with hostility, but with an unflinching assessment. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, dark knot that exposed the long line of her neck. She wore a heavy apron over a silk blouse, a practical layer over something delicate. She walked to the counter, wiping her hands on a rag, and looked at the invoice. "This is wrong," she said, tapping the screen. "I ordered 3 cases of the ceramic urns, not 2, and the hydrangeas were supposed to be the Dutch varietal, not the local." I blinked, shifting my weight. "I just drive the van, ma'am. I don't pack the boxes." "Don't call me ma'am," she murmured, her eyes scanning the rest of the list. "It makes you sound like you're trying to sell me insurance." She picked up the stylus, corrected the quantity on the screen with quick, sharp strokes, and signed her name. Isabella. The letters were jagged, hurried. She handed the clipboard back. Our fingers didn't touch. She was careful about that. But the proximity was enough to catch a scent off her. Not flowers, something sharper. Eucalyptus and cold water. "Bring the rest in through the side door," she instructed, already turning back to her roses. And try not to knock over the displays. You drive that hand truck like a blunt instrument. I stood there for a second, watching her return to her work. She was entirely self-contained, a woman who had curated every inch of her environment to be precise, beautiful, and controlled. I was just the transient element, the dust from the road, the necessary inconvenience. I was wheels and motion. She was roots and stillness. I went back to the van, the humidity of the shop clinging to my uniform. As I loaded the hand truck, I found myself checking my reflection in the side mirror, straightening my collar. It was a ridiculous impulse. She hadn't looked at me as a person. She'd looked at me as a logistical error to be corrected. But as I rolled the next crate toward the side door, I realized I wanted to see that cool, surgical gaze land on me again. I wanted to see if I could make it waver, even just a little. The challenge rippled through me, unexpected and sharp. The route was just a job, but the destination had suddenly become interesting. Routine acts like water on stone. It doesn't look like it's doing much, but give it enough time, and it changes the shape of everything. The coastal run settled into a rhythm that my body learned before my mind did. Tuesday and Thursday mornings became the anchor points of my week, the specific coordinates where the chaotic map of my life intersected with her carefully curated stillness. I found myself checking the clock at 9:45 a.m., anticipating the curve of the highway that would reveal the shop's awning. I started bringing coffee. It wasn't a discussed arrangement, just a peace offering I slid across the slate counter alongside the invoices. The first time, she looked at the cup like it might be a trap. "Black," I said, leaning against the counter, watching her inspect the lid. "No sugar. I figured you were sweet enough. Or maybe just bitter enough. I haven't decided yet." Isabella didn't smile, but the corner of her mouth twitched, a microscopic crack in the armor. "I prefer bitter," she said, taking the cup. "It keeps you alert." "To what?" "To drivers who try to charm their way out of late deliveries." "I'm on time today, Isabella. Check the timestamp." She did, of course. She checked everything. But over the next few weeks, I noticed the subtle shifts in the atmosphere. The way the aggressive snapping of her pruning shears would pause the moment the heavy metal door of my van slammed shut outside. She would never admit she was waiting, but the silence gave her away. When I walked in, she was already looking at the door, her hands still, her posture slightly less rigid than before. The distance between us began to shrink, measured in inches and accidental contact. It happened on a Thursday, during the morning rush. The shop was empty of customers, but full of inventory I had to unload. I was handing her the digital clipboard for a signature, and she reached for it without looking, her eyes scanning a crate of lilies. Her fingers brushed mine. It wasn't a grab or a hold, just a graze of skin against skin. But the reaction was immediate. I felt a static charge snap up my arm, a sudden, sharp awareness of her heat. She froze, her hand hovering over the stylus. For a second, the only sound in the room was the hum of the cooler and the blood rushing in my ears. She pulled back slightly, adjusting her grip on the clipboard. But she didn't retreat. She signed her name, the stylus moving slower than usual. "You have dirt on your cheek," she said, not looking up. I instinctively wiped at my face. "Hazard of the job. We can't all work in a climate-controlled paradise." "This isn't paradise," she murmured, finally meeting my eyes. "It's a high-maintenance ecosystem that requires constant surveillance." I laughed, a low sound that seemed to make the air vibrate. "You love it, though, the control. I bet you organize your spices alphabetically." "By cuisine profile, actually," she corrected, deadpan. "Alphabetical is inefficient." "Terrifying," I teased, stepping a little closer, testing the boundary. "In the best way. It's a good look on you, that intensity. Most people just let life happen to them. You curate it." Isabella looked at me then. really looked at me, and I saw the flush rise from the collar of her silk blouse. It wasn't embarrassment. It was recognition. Chaos has its own appeal, I suppose, she countered, her voice dropping a register. You get to leave. I have to stay and make sure nothing wilts. She turned to a massive, alien-looking orchid on the workbench. It was a complex tangle of roots and spotted petals. This one, she said, her voice softening, losing its professional edge. It refuses to bloom unless the temperature drops 10 degrees at night. It needs the cold to know it's alive. She touched the petal with a tenderness that made my breath catch. It was such a stark contrast to the shears, to the sharp lines of her face. Watching her hand cup that fragile bloom, I realized I wanted to be the thing she touched with that kind of reverence. I wanted to be the variable that made her bloom. We stood there in the quiet shop, dust motes dancing in the shafts of morning light between us, the smell of coffee and damp earth wrapping around us. It felt like we were on the edge of something, a precipice we were both pretending not to see. I didn't know it then, but the routine was about to break. It was just a Tuesday when the weather turned, changing the dynamic completely. The sky didn't just darken, it collapsed. One minute, the coastal highway was bathed in that flat, gray marine light, and the next, the clouds turned a bruised, angry purple. I was parked at the curb, the back doors wide open, staring down the barrel of the biggest delivery of the month. It was a wedding order, 4 dozen centerpieces involving white peonies and cascading ivy, delicate things that bruised if you looked at them wrong. The rain started as a hiss on the pavement, then escalated instantly to a roar. It was a deluge, a curtain of water so thick it blurred the edges of the world. Isabella didn't wait for me to navigate the hand truck. She came running out of the shop, abandoning her post behind the counter. This was a woman who treated moisture levels like a religion. Yet here she was, stepping into the downpour without hesitation. She was wearing a cream-colored silk blouse, something elegant and entirely unsuited for a monsoon. "We have to move them now!" she shouted over the sound of the rain, grabbing the edge of a crate. "Wait!" I dropped the crate I was holding back onto the van floor and stripped off my jacket. It was a heavy, lined denim trucker jacket, stiff from wear and ingrained with the smell of the road. I didn't think. I just moved. I stepped into her space, the rain plastering my hair to my forehead, and swung the jacket around her shoulders. "You're going to ruin the silk," I said, my voice rough. For a second, we were huddled together under the non-existent shelter of the van's open doors. My hands lingered on the denim, pulling the collar up to protect her neck. She looked up at me, raindrops caught in her eyelashes, her eyes wide and startled. The proximity was sudden and overwhelming. I could see the pulse jumping in the hollow of her throat. I was soaked in my t-shirt, shivering slightly, but she was wrapped in my warmth. "Okay," she breathed, the word lost in the thunder. "Okay." We worked in a chaotic blur, running crates from the van to the awning, our boots splashing through puddles that were forming faster than drains could clear them. We were a bucket brigade of 2, passing fragile white blooms between us, shoulders bumping, hands brushing against wet cardboard and slick stems. By the time the last crate was inside, we were both breathless, dripping water onto the polished concrete floor. Isabella didn't take the jacket off immediately. She stood by the drafting table, checking the inventory list with a frantic energy, making sure no petals were crushed. My jacket swallowed her. The sleeves hung past her hands and the shoulders were too broad, making her look smaller, softer, less like the fortress I knew and more like someone who needed guarding. Seeing her in my clothes did something to my chest, a tight, possessive ache I hadn't expected. 3 crates of peonies, she muttered, checking a box. She pushed her wet hair back with a trembling hand. Ivy looks intact. Thank God. She leaned over the table to inspect a particularly large arrangement, and the movement made the jacket shift. The heavy denim collar rode up against her cheek. That was when it happened. She froze. It wasn't a pause for thought. It was a biological halt, like an animal catching a scent on the wind. Her hand stopped mid-checkmark. I watched, mesmerized, as she tilted her head slightly, almost imperceptibly, toward the collar. She inhaled. It was a slow, deep breath, her eyes fluttering shut for a fraction of a second. She was smelling me. My jacket didn't smell like flowers. It smelled of the cedar dashboard of my van, the salt air of the coast, the stale coffee I drank on the road, and the specific, warm skin scent of my own perfume. It was a scent of motion, of heat, of me. When she opened her eyes, she didn't look at the flowers. She looked at me. The distance across the room vanished. Her gaze was dark, shaken, stripped of all its professional armor. She looked like she had just woken up in a room she didn't recognize. There was fear there, yes, but underneath the fear was a raw, hungry curiosity. She realized, in that silent, dripping moment, that I wasn't just a delivery schedule. I was a physical reality. Slowly, her hands came up to the lapels of the jacket. She didn't shrug it off carelessly. She slid it from her shoulders with a deliberate slowness, as if the denim had weight, as if she was reluctant to let the heat escape. "You're soaking wet," she said. Her voice was steady, but it was an octave lower than usual. She held the jacket out to me, her fingers gripping the fabric tight before letting go. "I'll dry," I said, taking it. The denim was still warm from her body. "Thank you," she whispered. "For the flowers." "For the flowers," I repeated. I put the jacket back on. It felt different now. It felt heavy with the memory of her shape. I turned to leave, the bell above the door chiming its usual bright note, but the sound fell flat in the thick atmosphere. She returned the jacket, but she couldn't return the moment. The air in the shop felt heavier, charged with the static of something that had just begun to storm. The days following the storm didn't dry out. They just held the humidity. The shop felt smaller, the air tighter. We didn't talk about the jacket or the way she had inhaled the scent of my skin from the collar, but the memory of it sat on the counter between us like a physical object. The professional barrier that had kept us safely in our respective lanes, driver and florist, transient and rooted, was visibly cracked. And instead of patching it, I found myself looking for ways to widen the breach. I started lingering. The drop-offs that used to take 5 minutes stretched to 10, then 15. I told myself it was about checking the invoices, but we both knew the paperwork was flawless. I stayed because I wanted to see if I could make her lose that terrifying composure again. It happened on a Wednesday, while she was wrestling with a massive architectural arrangement of birds of paradise and stiff branches. She was frowning, her movements sharp and aggressive as she forced a particularly stubborn branch into the floral foam. She looked fierce, her jaw set, her hands moving with a capability that was almost frightening. "You handle those stems like you're diffusing a bomb," I said, leaning my hip against the slate counter, watching her work. Or maybe building one. Isabella didn't stop, but her eyes flicked to me. Structural integrity is the difference between art and a compost pile. If you don't force the line, the eye wanders. "You don't let anything wander, do you?" I asked, my voice dropping just enough to turn the observation into something else. "You run this place like a battleship. It's intense." She paused, a pair of wire cutters hovering over a stem. "Is that a complaint?" "No," I said, locking eyes with her. "It's a compliment. You're intimidating, Isabella. In the best way." The reaction was subtle, but to me, it looked like an earthquake. A flush rose from the high collar of her blouse, pink and sudden, spreading up her neck to her ears. She looked down quickly, reaching for a spool of silk ribbon to tie off the vase. Her fingers, usually so dexterous and sure, fumbled. The knot slipped. She tried again, but her hands were shaking just slightly, a tremor of nerves that betrayed the cool authority of her voice. "You're distracting," she murmured, abandoning the knot to smooth the ribbon flat with her thumb. "I'm just standing here," I said, suppressing a smile. "I'm part of the scenery." "You are absolutely not scenery," she shot back, finally looking up. Her eyes were bright, defensive, and undeniably alive. "You take up too much space. That driver term of yours might work on the highway patrol to get you out of tickets, but it's a liability in a shop that requires precision." "Driver charm?" I laughed, stepping closer. "Is that what we're calling it? I thought I was just being friendly." "Friendly as bringing coffee," she said, her voice regaining some of its dry wit, though the flush remained. Whatever this is inefficient." "Maybe efficiency isn't everything," I countered softly. The air between us grew heavy, thick with the scent of the new shipment I had just unloaded. It was crate after crate of stargazer lilies, their petals wide open and speckled with crimson. The smell was narcotic, spicy, sweet, and overwhelming. It filled the silence, turning the atmosphere into something viscous and heady. It felt like the scent of the tension itself, a physical manifestation of the thing we weren't saying. I went back to stacking the empty crates by the door, trying to give her space. But the feeling of being watched prickled the back of my neck. It was a magnetic pull, undeniable and sharp. I turned around suddenly, catching her before she could look away. Isabella was standing by the cooler, a single lily in her hand. She wasn't inspecting the flower, she was looking at me. Her gaze was intense, dark, and filled with a raw curiosity that stripped away the last of the pretense. She was studying the line of my shoulders, the way my sleeves were rolled up, the dust on my boots. It wasn't the look of a florist checking a delivery. It was the look of a woman realizing she was hungry. She didn't look away immediately. She held my gaze for a heartbeat too long, the air crackling between us, before she turned sharply back to the cooler, the glass door sealing her away in the cold. The days were manageable, filled with these small electric skirmishes, but the nights required overtime. The transition from day to night in the shop wasn't just a matter of light. It was a shift in frequency. The neon "open" sign in the window flickered and died with a buzzing sigh, plunging the front of the store into a gray twilight. Isabella locked the front door, the deadbolt sliding home with a heavy, final thunk that echoed in the sudden silence. But inside, the work wasn't finished. It was the week before Mother's Day, the floral equivalent of a Category 5 hurricane, and the back room was a war zone of buckets, stems, and panic. I should have been halfway down the coast, eating diner food and finding a motel. Instead, I was rolling up my sleeves. "You don't have to do this," Isabella said, though she didn't stop me when I grabbed a stack of galvanized buckets. She was standing by the sink, filling vases with a nutrient solution that smelled faintly of bleach and sugar. She looked exhausted. The severe bun had loosened, strands of dark hair escaping to curl against her neck, and she had kicked off her sensible flats, working in her stocking feet on the cold concrete. "I clocked out an hour ago," I lied, stacking the buckets with a metallic clatter. "Besides, watching you try to lift these 5-gallon drums onto the top shelf is painful. You have the upper body strength of a hummingbird." "I have leverage and physics on my side," she countered, but her voice lacked its usual bite. She sounded grateful. And hummingbirds are incredibly territorial. Don't underestimate them. "I'm terrified," I said, grinning at her over a mound of hydrangeas. We worked in a new kind of intimacy. The shop was dimly lit, illuminated only by the under-cabinet LEDs and the glow of the cooler. She had put music on her phone, setting it on the drafting table. Not the classical I expected, but a low, smoky jazz playlist that made the shadows feel longer and the air warmer. The atmosphere was stripped of the customer service polish. It was just labor. It was sweat and the smell of green waste and the rhythmic sound of stems being cut. There was something raw about it. I moved the heavy inventory, hefting crates of roses and massive bags of soil, my muscles burning in a good, solid way. I caught her watching me more than once. She wasn't looking at my face. She was watching my forearms as I lifted a crate, her gaze tracking the movement of the tendons. When I caught her eye, she didn't flush this time. She just held the look, a dark, unreadable expression that made my pulse hammer in my throat. The shop was narrow, designed for flowers, not people. The aisles between the prep tables were tight, forcing us into a choreography of avoidance that was rapidly failing. We both reached for the same glass vase at the exact same moment. It was sitting on a low shelf in the narrowest part of the room. I crouched down. She leaned over. My arm brushed against hers, from the elbow down to the wrist. It wasn't a quick bump. It was a slide, a friction of skin against skin that felt electric in the damp air. We both froze. I didn't pull back, neither did she. I could smell her clearly, the floral sap, the coffee, and that underlying scent of rain and skin that was driving me slowly insane. She was close enough that I could see the fine grain of her skin, the fatigue shadows under her eyes, the way her breath hitched in her chest. "Isabella," I said, my voice low, barely over the music. She stayed there, paralyzed by the contact, her arm warm against mine. "This is inefficient," she whispered, but the word had no weight. "We're not talking about efficiency," I murmured. She pulled away first, straightening up sharply, clutching the vase to her chest like a shield. She turned her back to me, moving to the other side of the room, putting the width of a drafting table between us. The air felt thin where she had been. "Why do you stay here?" I asked after a long silence, needing to break the tension before it snapped us both. "In this town, in this shop, you have the talent for the city. You could be doing high-end events in LA or San Francisco." Isabella didn't look up from the roses she was processing. "Cities are loud. They're full of people who want things they don't understand." She stripped a thorn with a violent snap. "Here, I know the variables. I know the soil. I know the people. There's a difference between solitude and hiding, Isabella." She stopped moving. The jazz trumpet on her phone cried out, a lonely, high note. She rested her hands on the edge of the table, her head bowed. "I built this place to be a fortress," she admitted, her voice so quiet I had to step closer to hear it. "I thought if I made everything beautiful and perfect and controlled, I wouldn't need anything else. I never expected to want anything outside of these four walls." "And now?" I asked, daring to step into her space again. She turned, her eyes wide and vulnerable, stripped of all her usual armor. "Now," she said, her voice trembling, "I feel like the walls are closing in. Or maybe I'm just tired of being the only thing holding them up." We were close enough to bridge the gap, but the doubt crept in. I expected the morning to carry the warmth of the night before, like pavement radiating heat long after the sun goes down. I was wrong. When I walked into Verdant and Vine the next day, the atmosphere wasn't just cool, it was glacial. The vulnerability, the shared music, the quiet confession about walls closing in, it had all been scrubbed away, sanitized with the same ruthless efficiency she used on the countertops. Isabella was back behind the drafting table, and the fortress was fully reconstructed. She was wearing a crisp, high-collared shirt buttoned to the throat, her hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful. She didn't look up when the door chime announced me. She didn't pause. She was working on a bridal bouquet, a tight, spherical prison of white roses and stephanotis, her hands moving with a mechanical precision that bordered on aggressive. "Delivery," I said, the word feeling heavy and clumsy in the silence. "Leave it by the cooler," she said. Her voice was flat, stripped of all the texture I had heard the night before. It was the voice she used for telemarketers and tax auditors. "And please check the invoice carefully. I don't have time for errors today. I stood there, holding a tray of coffees. One black, one with the oat milk she had admitted to liking 3 weeks ago, and felt like an intruder in my own story. The rejection was physical. It hit me in the chest, a sharp, hollow ache. I set the coffees down on the slate counter. The cardboard cup made a dull sound that seemed too loud in the aggressive quiet. "I brought you coffee," I said, trying to catch her eye. "Oat milk. I thought you might need it after the late night." "I've already had coffee," she replied, still not looking at me. She picked up a spool of floral tape, wrapping a stem with quick, jerky movements. "I have a wedding in 2 hours. The bride is hysterical, and the humidity is wilting the stephanotis. I really need you to just drop the inventory and go." I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a mix of embarrassment and frustration. Had I imagined it? The way she had looked at me in the dim light, the way her breath had hitched when our arms brushed, the late-night confession about loneliness. Standing there in the harsh morning light, watching her retreat behind a wall of white roses, I started to doubt my own reality. Maybe I was just the driver. Maybe I had read desperation as desire, projected my own attraction onto a woman who was simply tired and overworked. I unloaded the van in silence. Every trip through the door felt like walking through a force field. She didn't offer to help. She didn't tease me about my parking or the chaos of the road. She just worked, her back stiff, her focus narrowed down to the microscopic details of the bouquet in her hands. She was hiding. I knew it, and she knew I knew it, and that only made the distance between us wider. By the time I brought the last crate in, the silence was unbearable. It was thick and suffocating, filled with everything we weren't saying. I couldn't leave it like this. I couldn't get back in the van and drive 2 hours down the coast with this coldness sitting in my gut like a stone. I walked up to the drafting table, ignoring the employees-only vibe she was radiating. I leaned my hands on the slate, forcing myself into her peripheral vision. "Isabella," I said quietly. "I am working," she snapped, grabbing a pair of wire cutters. Did I do something wrong? The question hung in the air, simple and devastating. Her hands froze. The wire cutters hovered over a stem of baby's breath. For a second, just a second, the mask slipped. I saw the tension in her jaw, the way her throat worked as she swallowed. "No," she said, but she didn't look at me. She stared at the flowers as if they held the secrets of the universe. "You didn't do anything. The inventory count is off, the wedding is stressful, I have a business to run." "It doesn't feel like business," I pressed, my voice low. "It feels like you're regretting talking to me. It feels like you're trying to erase last night." "Nothing happened last night," she said sharply, finally looking up. Her eyes were hard, but there was panic behind them. "We worked. We talked. That's it." "Is it?" I held her gaze, refusing to back down. "Because I can still smell the rain on that jacket, Isabella. And I think you can too." She flinched. It was microscopic, a tiny recoil, but I saw it. Her gaze dropped to my chest, then skittered away. She reached for a rose, her fingers trembling. It was a betrayal of her body, a physical admission that her mind was trying to deny. She couldn't thread the wire through the calyx. She tried once, twice, her hand shaking so badly the rose bobbed like it was in a windstorm. "I can't do this right now," she whispered, the fight draining out of her. "Please, just go." "I'm going," I said, stepping back. The victory of seeing her affect felt hollow. I didn't want to be right. I wanted to be close. But you can't wire shut every feeling you have, Isabella. Eventually, the stems snap. I turned and walked out. The bell above the door rang, a cheerful sound that felt mocking. I got into the van and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. She was scared. I knew that. She was terrified of the disruption I represented. But as I started the engine and pulled away from the curb, I looked in the rearview mirror. The open sign was still off. She was still in there, alone with her perfect flowers and her shaking hands. The distance between us was back, measured in miles and silence. But the sky to the west was turning a dark, bruised purple. Nature, however, has a way of forcing the issue. I didn't make it to the county line. The storm that had been bruising the horizon finally broke, and it didn't just rain. It tried to wash the world away. The Pacific Coast Highway became a river of mud and runoff within minutes. I saw the red flares of the highway patrol ahead, the barricades going up across the asphalt. Landslide risk. The road was closed. I had two choices: sleep in my van on the side of a cliff while the world dissolved around me, or turn back. I turned back. The drive back to the shop was a white-knuckle crawl. The wind buffeted the high sides of the van, trying to shove me into the guardrails. By the time I saw the awning of verdant and vine, my hands were cramping from gripping the wheel. The open sign was dark, obviously, but I saw a faint movement inside. I parked the van tight against the building, shielding it from the wind, and ran for the door. I didn't have to knock. Isabella was there before my hand hit the glass. She unlocked it, pulling me inside with a frantic urgency that had nothing to do with business hours. "The highway is closed," I said, breathless, dripping water onto her slate floor for the second time in our acquaintance. "They turned everyone back." "I know," she said, her voice tight. "I was listening to the radio. I was worried you were stuck on the ridge." Before I could answer, the shop plunged into darkness. The power didn't flicker, it just died. The hum of the floral cooler, the constant background noise of her world cut out instantly. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing in on my ears. The gray light from the storm outside filtered through the front windows, casting long, skeletal shadows across the rows of buckets. "Well," I said into the gloom, "that's dramatic." "The back," Isabella said. "We have emergency supplies in the break room." We navigated the darkened shop by memory and instinct. The back room, usually a place of harsh fluorescent light and inventory lists, felt different in the dark. It felt smaller, intimate. Isabella found a box of matches and a stack of heavy beeswax candles. Not the cheap emergency kind, but the expensive, slow-burning pillars she sold for wedding centerpieces. She lit them, one by one. The flare of the match illuminated her face in brief, golden bursts. I watched her hands. They were steady now. The tremor from the morning was gone, replaced by a deliberate focus. As the candlelight filled the room, the atmosphere shifted. The storm raged outside, throwing rain against the high windows like handfuls of gravel. But inside, the air was still and warm. The scent of the beeswax mixed with the damp wool of my uniform and the ever-present smell of cut stems. It felt like we were inside a capsule, suspended outside of time. I sat on a crate of vases, watching her. She stood by the drafting table, the candlelight catching the hollow of her throat, the line of her jaw. She looked less like a florist and more like a painting from a century ago, something captured in oil and shadow. "You're not going to kick me out?" I asked quietly. "It's unsafe," she murmured, not looking at me. She was watching the flame of the nearest candle. "I'm strict, not homicidal." "Isabella." "I'm not cold," she said suddenly, answering a question I hadn't asked. She turned to face me, and the raw honesty in her expression took the air out of my lungs. "This morning, when I told you to leave, I wasn't being cold. I was terrified." "Terrified of what?" "Of how much I hated it when you walked out that door." She took a step toward me, crossing the invisible line she had drawn between us weeks ago. "When you left, the silence in here didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt empty. I've spent 10 years loving the silence, and in the span of a few weeks, you've made it feel like a cage." I stood up. The space between us was charged, heavy with the storm and the heat of the candles. I didn't mean to ruin your peace." "You didn't ruin it," she whispered. "You woke me up." She reached out, her hand hovering in the space between us, before she found the courage to touch the lapel of my jacket, the same jacket I had wrapped around her in the rain. Her fingers grazed the denim, tracing the seam. "That day with the coat," she said, her voice dropping to a register that vibrated in my chest. "It wasn't just the scent, it was the reality of you. I smelled the cedar and the salt, and I realized I had been holding my breath for years. I went home that night, and I couldn't sleep because the air in my house felt too clean. It felt sterile." She looked up at me, her eyes dark and unflinching in the candlelight. "I don't want a sterile life anymore. I want the mess. I want the driver who tracks mud onto my floors and challenges me on my inventory counts." "Be careful what you ask for," I warned, my voice rough. "I'm not a botanical specimen you can control." "I know," she breathed, stepping closer until I could feel the warmth radiating from her. "That's the point." The truth was out, and there was nowhere left to hide. The confession hung in the air between us, shimmering in the candlelight like the heat haze off the asphalt in August. Isabella had laid her weapon down. Her silence, her control, her perfectly curated distance, and was standing before me, defenseless. It was a terrifying amount of trust to hand someone, especially a driver who was just supposed to be passing through. I closed the last inch of distance. It felt like crossing a border, leaving the familiar territory of professional banter and entering a country where the language was entirely new. I didn't rush. The storm was screaming against the glass, battering the shop with wind and rain. But inside the circle of candlelight, time had slowed to a honeyed drip. "Isabella," I said, and my voice sounded rough to my own ears, stripped of the easy charm I used as a shield. "You don't have to be the fortress right now. You don't have to hold the roof up." She let out a breath that was half sigh, half shudder. "I don't know how to be anything else. I've spent so long reinforcing the walls. I forgot where the door was." "I found it," I whispered. I raised my hands slowly, giving her every second to pull away, to retreat back into her efficiency. She didn't move. She watched my hand approach with wide, dark eyes, her gaze unflinching, even as her breathing grew shallow. When my fingers finally brushed the line of her jaw, the contact was electric. Her skin was fever warm, soft in a way that contradicted the sharp angles of her face. She leaned into my touch. It was a small movement, a surrender of millimeters, but it felt like a landslide. The tension that she carried in her shoulders, the rigid posture she wore like armor, seemed to dissolve at the point of contact. She closed her eyes, and for the first time, the lines of exhaustion around her mouth smoothed out. "It's quiet," she murmured, her lips barely moving. "It's just us," I answered. "No inventory, no invoices, no schedules." I traced the line of her cheekbone with my thumb, mapping the tension away. She turned her face into my palm, a gesture of such profound vulnerability that it made my chest ache. The air in the shop thickened, charged with the scent of beeswax and the damp, earthy smell of the storm. But underneath it all was the scent of her, that clean, sharp eucalyptus and the warmth of skin. "I tried to make you leave," she admitted, her voice barely audible over the rain. "I tried to be cold, but then I saw your jacket on the hook by the door, and I remembered how it felt to be warm." "You don't have to be cold anymore." I moved my hand to the nape of her neck, my fingers tangling in the loose strands of hair that had escaped her bun. Her pulse was hammering against my fingertips, a frantic, bird-like rhythm that betrayed the calm of her expression. She reached up then, her hands gripping the lapels of my denim jacket, pulling me closer. It wasn't a tentative pull. It was a demand. It was the mess she had asked for. When her mouth found mine, it wasn't a collision. It was a confirmation. The kiss started slow, deliberate. It tasted of rain and hesitation, a question asked and answered in the same breath. Her lips were soft, yielding in a way I hadn't expected from a woman made of sharp edges. I felt her sigh against me, a sound that vibrated through my own body. And then, the hesitation vanished. The kiss deepened, becoming something raw and hungry. It was the breaking of a dam. All the weeks of stolen glances, of accidental brushes against clipboards, of the charged silence in the morning light, it all poured into this moment. Her hands moved from my jacket to my neck, her fingers threading into my hair, gripping tight, anchoring herself to me. I pulled her flush against me, one arm wrapping around her waist, savoring the immediate reality of her weight. She felt solid, real, no longer just an image behind a counter, but a woman in my arms. It felt like a suture. That was the only word for it. It felt like the jagged edges of two different lives were being knitted together, the wound of our separate loneliness closing up. It was complex, like a difficult algorithm finally resolving into a clean, simple answer. The storm outside could tear the coast apart, the roads could wash away, the schedule could dissolve into chaos, and it wouldn't matter. The only coordinate that mattered was this one. We broke apart slowly, breathless, our foreheads resting against each other. The candlelight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls of the shop. The sound of the rain was still a roar, but it felt distant now, a background track to the heavy, ragged sound of our breathing. Isabella opened her eyes. The dark irises were blown wide, filled with a mixture of shock and wonder. She looked thoroughly shaken, her lipstick smudged, her hair in disarray, and I had never seen anything more beautiful in my life. "Okay," she whispered, her voice husky. "Okay, that wasn't sterile." "No," I said, running my thumb over her bottom lip. "That was real." She let out a shaky laugh, burying her face in the curve of my neck. We stood there in the center of her fortress, surrounded by the scent of roses and rain, holding each other while the candles burned down. The tension of the weeks had evaporated, replaced by a deep, resonant hum of connection. The storm passed, but the world looked different in the morning. The light that broke into the back room wasn't the harsh, bruised gray of the storm. It was a brilliant, aggressive gold that cut through the high windows. I woke up on a makeshift cot of shipping blankets, my back aching against the concrete floor. But I had never felt more rested. The shop was silent again, but the quality of the silence had shifted. It wasn't a void waiting to be filled with noise. It was a pause, a breath held in anticipation. Isabella was already awake. She was sitting on the edge of the drafting table, her legs dangling, holding 2 mugs of coffee. Her hair was down, a dark, heavy curtain around her shoulders that softened the severe lines of her face. She was wearing yesterday's clothes. The silk blouse was rumpled, the apron gone, and she looked stripped of her armor. She looked tired, human, and devastatingly real. "The road is open," she said quietly as I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. She handed me a mug. The ceramic was warm, the coffee inside lukewarm and bitter. It tasted like reality. "Dispatch will be screaming," I said, taking a sip. "I'm 12 hours behind schedule. The coastal run doesn't wait for weather." "You could leave now," she offered. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a test. She was watching me over the rim of her cup, her eyes dark and guarded again. She was giving me an out, a chance to return to the status quo where I was the motion and she was the stillness. "You could make up the time if you drive fast." I looked at her, really looked at her in the unforgiving morning light. I saw the fear behind the offer. She was waiting for the transient element to do what it always does: move on, leaving nothing but tire tracks and a signed invoice. I could, I agreed, setting the coffee down on a crate. But the schedule has to change, Isabella. She tightened her grip on the mug, her knuckles turning white. I can't be a pit stop, she said, her voice steady but low. I can't be the place you visit when you need to feel grounded, only to watch you drive away when the itch for the horizon comes back. I am rooted here. My life is in this soil. I can't chase you down the highway. I'm not asking you to chase anything, I said. I stood up and walked to her, stepping into the space between her knees. The proximity was familiar now, not charged with fear, but with a heavy, magnetic comfort. I'm telling you that I'm done driving past. I want to be the thing that stays. Isabella looked up at me, searching my face for the lie, for the easy driver's charm she had accused me of weeks ago. She didn't find it. Slowly, a smile broke across her face. It wasn't the polite customer service smile or the dry, ironic smirk she used as a shield against the world. It was genuine, unguarded, and terrifyingly open. It reached her eyes, crinkling the corners, transforming her from the formidable owner of Verdant and Vine into just Isabella. It's going to be messy, she warned, leaning her forehead against my stomach, a gesture of surrender. My inventory is a disaster. The floor is covered in mud, and you take up a lot of space in my quiet shop. We'll make room, I promised, my hand finding the back of her neck, my thumb tracing the pulse that beat there. I'm good at logistics. We spent the next hour putting the fortress back together. It was domestic work, sweeping the dried mud from the slate floors, restacking the crates, throwing out the stems that hadn't survived the night. When I went to unlock the front door and flip the sign to open, the bell chimed. It wasn't an interruption this time. It was just the start of the day. Isabella was arranging a fresh display of hydrangeas near the window, her hands moving with that familiar surgical grace. As I passed her to head to the van, not to leave, but to finish the route so I could come back, our hands brushed. It wasn't accidental. Her fingers caught mine, a brief, firm squeeze of acknowledgement. It was a silent conversation, a promise made in the language of touch. I wasn't just passing through anymore. I had found a place to stop. The route was the same, the asphalt was the same, but the destination had fundamentally changed. The bell above the door rang, a sharp, clear note that cut through the morning air. The shop smelled different now. The heavy, suffocating humidity of the storm had finally lifted, replaced by the crisp, masculine scent of cedar from my jacket, mixing with the sweet, heady perfume of her roses. It was a blend that shouldn't have worked, but it did. I looked back one last time before heading out to the van. My heavy denim coat was hanging on the hook next to her delicate silk scarf, the rough fabric settling against the weave like it belonged there. It was a small detail, a flag planted in her territory, but it meant everything. If you enjoyed this story of finding roots on the road, hit subscribe for more.